Hello guys, welcome back to our anime moments. Guys, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Today is explanation of upcoming episode of Soul Land 2 Part 135 based on novel. So let's start. The biggest difference between Soul Masters with twin martial souls and those with only one was that when Soul Masters with twin martial souls switched between their martial souls, their soul power would swiftly fuse with that martial soul. Huiyuhao's spiritual power was sufficiently strong at this point that he could even use both of his martial souls at the same time under certain circumstances. Using both martial souls at the same time meant fusing one distinct part of his soul power with his respective martial souls at the same time. He couldn't do it for a prolonged period of time, and could only do it once or twice before he had to choose one martial soul. However, this method undoubtedly enabled him to connect his two martial souls more perfectly in an actual battle, and if this connection was utilized appropriately, it would be no different from using both martial souls at the same time. Huiyuhao had only just mastered this method. It was a pity that his newfound ability was far from sufficient against an ultimate Doluo like Yi Shishui. He didn't even have a chance to use it. The mysterious heaven technique's pure soul power began to rotate in Huiyuhao's palm. To ensure his safety, Huiyuhao only used half the soul power that he had used when he was experimenting inside his body. Milky white soul power continued to rotate, and gradually became like a whirlpool. It was like a ball of milky white liquid, and it seemed very strange and unique. Huiyuhao allowed it to start its rotations before he gradually began to compress the milky white soul power while it rotated. He was very careful with his movements, and he made the compression process as balanced as possible. Doing so would hopefully avoid the phenomenon that had occurred the last time, where some parts solidified, while other parts remained in liquid form. Since he had decided to do this, he would have to do it as perfectly as possible. Only then would he achieve the best results. Milky white light shone faintly. Huiyuhao concentrated on his task, and the white whirlpool's volume quickly became smaller under his manipulation. It didn't take long before it was half its original size. Huiyuhao was especially meticulous in controlling the whirlpool this time, so it didn't show any signs of solidifying. It only became a lot thicker, and rotating it seemed to become increasingly harder. Huiyuhao used even more spiritual power. With his prior experience, he immediately raised his spiritual power while he made sure he was even more careful with his manipulation. The small white whirlpool became increasingly small, while the milky white hues became increasingly withdrawn as the thick liquid-like state began to solidify. It started to spin faster and faster under Huiyuhao's control. Huiyuhao remembered very clearly that every single existence that resembled black holes in the beast god's body were rotating at a speed that was almost indiscernible to the naked eye. Their rotation speeds were evidently important to utilizing spatial power. He didn't know the trick to that yet, so he had to experiment according to what he could observe. The whirlpool began to rotate even faster while it became even smaller, and it slowly began to solidify. Huiyuhao could feel that he was onto something. The tiny whirlpool was gradually compressed to the size of a yellow bean. It had become completely solid at this point, and was shaped like a funnel. It continued rotating vigorously, while the soul power aura that it was emanating became increasingly weak. Does this mean that I can solidify my soul power, and store it externally? That's just miraculous. If I can do that, what will happen if I place this highly compressed soul power into milk bottles? What kind of effect will I achieve? Milk bottles were useful, but the soul power they could contain was ultimately limited, and even milk bottles of higher classes were only equivalent to a soul sage's soul power. Milk bottles weren't that important for higher-tier soul engineers. Perhaps I can devise a milk bottle of an even higher class if I didn't have any distractions. Huiyuhao was elated from his surprise discovery. He began to observe the milky funnel even more intricately, without overlooking any details. He continued to use more spiritual power at the same time to compress the funnel, and so that he could keep it rotating. The yellow bean gradually became the size of a green bean. Huiyuhao could feel that his soul power was being compressed almost to its maximum level, while its rotation speed seemed to have reached a limit as well. It would be difficult for his spiritual power to make it spin even faster. But its volume hasn't changed qualitatively. No matter how I look at it, it's just a small object that's spinning continuously. How did this happen? When it was inside my body previously, I hadn't compressed it to such a level, and it had already begun absorbing my soul power. Right, it has to continuously absorb soul power? Hui Yuhao's eyes lit up. He carefully released a little more soul power. Indeed, the solid funnel that was spinning furiously sensed Hui Yuhao's soul power, and seems to quiver subtly before a powerful gravitational force immediately emerged from it and swallowed the soul power that Hui Yuhao had released. The tiny funnel began to spin even faster after swallowing that bit of soul power. Furthermore, the gravitational force that it produced began to strengthen, and Hui Yuhao could clearly feel that the little thing was starting to consume the origin energy of heaven and earth around it as well. That wasn't all, this gravitational force was acting on his own body as well, as if it wanted to absorb even more of his soul power. This process was just so strange. Hui Yuhao was very excited at this point, and he immediately released another thread of soul power for the funnel to absorb as he closely monitored the funnel's transformations. The tiny funnel began to spin even faster after it consumed that soul power, and was now spinning at a speed that was so quick that Hui Yuhao could barely see what state it was in. More importantly, the funnel no longer needed Hui Yuhao's spiritual power to control it after it absorbed his soul power. It could now maintain its high rotation speed on its own. At the same time, it began to absorb the origin energy around it more quickly. Is it strengthening itself on its own? Have I done it? 15 minutes had gone by since Hui Yuhao had released this thing, and more strange and mystical phenomena gradually began to appear on it. Hui Yuhao's mind was steady and calm. He didn't continue releasing soul power into the funnel under such circumstances. Instead, he focused on closely observing how the funnel transformed after absorbing more of the origin energy of heaven and earth. The funnel's volume had evidently increased after absorbing his soul power twice. Its mass had increased to that of a yellow bin after both instances. The funnel's volume was increasing at a decreasing rate as it continued to absorb the origin energy around it. However, it was still increasing in size as it continued absorbing energy, and its rotation speed continued to increase as well. Hui Yuhao attempted to attach his spiritual power to the funnel. He could still do it in the beginning, but now his spiritual power was tossed back out very quickly. The funnel seemed to have created a strange magnetic field with its high-speed rotations. This magnetic field seemed to affect the space around it. That's it, this should be it. If its rotation speed increases to a certain level, and if the funnel itself becomes sufficiently strong, perhaps it will become like the soul power inside the beast god's body. But how am I to store this inside my own body? If I can't store it, then won't everything be meaningless? Hui Yuhao wasn't worried. He just sat on his bed with his legs crossed as he used his spiritual power to observe the funnel's state. This little thing was continuing to spin faster and faster and was consuming energy at a continuously faster rate. After an hour, its volume had increased by another 30%. Hui Yuhao discovered upon closer inspection that the spatial undulations around it weren't obvious, as if this phenomenon was because the funnel itself was far from strong enough. However, in terms of volume, the funnel seemed similar to those black holes when the beast god was using his soul power. However, even if that was the case, Hui Yuhao could already feel that this little thing was very dangerous. It was like a storeroom full of gunpowder that could be ignited at any time, and if anything collided with it, the soul power that was rotating at high speed could become unstable and would definitely explode. Unfortunately, he was inside an army camp, so he couldn't test how it would look like after it exploded. He would have to find another place for that. Hui Yuhao channeled his spiritual power with that thought and enveloped this funnel from the outside as he began to attempt to gradually reduce its speed. This circumstance was different from when the soul power was inside his body. This time, perhaps because the funnel was simply spinning too quickly, he ran into a small problem as he tried to control it. Hui Yuhao's spiritual power was just starting to interact with it when the funnel immediately displayed signs of instability, as if it were instantly about to explode. Hui Yuhao hurriedly reduced the amount of pressure he was putting on it with his spiritual power before the tiny funnel stabilized once more. However, that wasn't enough to stump Hui Yuhao. First, he used a spiritual barrier to cut off the funnel's connection to the outside world so that it could no longer absorb the origin energy around it to strengthen itself, before he gradually reduced its rotation speed so that it would gradually slow down in its stabilized state. He took 15 minutes to make this solid-state soul power stop spinning completely. The funnel finally presented itself in a conical shape in his hands, while the compressed soul power began to dissipate swiftly because it was no longer spinning as Hui Yuhao reabsorbed it into his body. This process continued for about 2 hours. Hui Yuhao still hadn't discovered the trick after close inspection, but at least he had managed to finish his experiment. Perhaps this introductory experiment will give me even more unexpected surprises? What I need now is to make more observations. I need to go outside. Hui Yuhao exited his tent and glanced toward somewhere not far from him, the tent that belonged to Tang Wutong. He gradually activated his martial soul and used imitation. His passageways still felt a little painful, but there wasn't a problem if he didn't forcefully channel a lot of soul power. He didn't want to give up on such a fantastic opportunity many times. Inspiration was but something that occurred over an instant, and perhaps he would never find the same inspiration again if he missed it. Therefore, Hui Yuhao didn't hesitate for too long. He immediately concealed himself through imitation and snuck out of the camp. The Star Luo Empire's camp didn't have that many surveillance soul tools. With his ability and deliberate intentions, he quickly managed to get out. Hui Yuhao accelerated after leaving the army camp, though he only used less than 30% of his soul power as he raced into the distance. His body's physical state was a little better than he had imagined. There wasn't too much of a burden on his body as long as he suppressed his soul power to a certain level, and this was undoubtedly a beneficial result for him. He went more than 10 kilometers away from the camp before he slowed down. He found a small hill and went behind it, and then used his spiritual power to sense if there was anybody around him before he began his experiment once more. With his previous experience, Hui Yuhao directly released even more soul power than before this time, and began to rotate and compress it. He took half the time that he did before, and the soul power that he had released took the shape of a solid funnel. He was no longer inside the army camp. There was nobody else around him, and he wasn't afraid of this thing exploding anymore. The funnel hovered in midair. Its rotation speed was increasing very quickly as Hui Yuhao continued infusing soul power into it, and it began to absorb the origin energy of heaven and earth around it crazily. It didn't take long before the solid funnel became the size of a fist. White lightning streaks were faintly visible around it, and the space around it also began to contort. Hui Yuhao continued to observe closely as he reduced the amount of soul power that he released. This fist-sized solid funnel had a gravitational force that was much stronger than the first one, and even if he reduced the amount of soul power that he released, this thing would still automatically absorb his soul power. Hui Yuhao could clearly feel that his soul power was even flowing out from his pores to fuse with the funnel, and all the origin energy within 1,000 square meters around him was being aggregated at lightning speed. The funnel's volume and rotation speed were also increasing continuously. What kind of law does this follow? Hui Yuhao wasn't sure, but he understood that the more soul power this funnel contained, the closer it came to the special characteristics of the beast god soul power. Of course, this was only one of the black holes inside Di Qian's internal soul power. Hui Yuhao stopped releasing soul power as he gradually moved backwards to distance himself from the funnel. However, he quickly realized to his surprise that there seemed to be some kind of unknown pulling force coming from his body. As the funnel actually shifted along with him, it was chasing him. Are you kidding me? Hui Yuhao wasn't confident of making it stop, as it had become so big. He was astonished, and couldn't be bothered with the fact that his passageways hadn't recovered completely. Light flashed around his body as he used instant teleportation, and he used it at its maximum range. Hui Yuhao disappeared 100 meters away with a flash. The funnel quivered faintly, and it seemed to have lost its target, and finally stopped chasing him. Hui Yuhao finally heaved a sigh as he continued shifting backwards. He placed 200 meters between the funnel and himself before he used spiritual detection to scrutinize its state. The funnel's volume and rotation speed were also increasingly continuously along with its soul power. Its gravitational force became stronger as it became larger, and even the stones and sand around it were being pulled in its direction. However, it was immediately ground to dust by the powerful soul power. The space around the tiny funnel slowly began to contort even more. Its volume was still increasing as it spun, but its rotation seemed a little irregular, while the funnel itself was no longer stable. It was trembling faintly. I'm losing control. An ominous feeling surfaced in Hui Yuhao's heart as he pounced behind a small hill on the side. Boom, 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 intense explosions could be heard as a vigorous airflow rushed over his head. The sound waves were deafening as intense soul power undulations erupted in all directions. However, everything settled down very quickly. Hui Yuhao looked up at where the funnel was before, and he could see an enormous crater that was 30 meters in diameter and more than 10 meters deep. A hurricane seemed to have swept over the large crater, and he could see many marks like blade cuts around it. This? Hui Yuhao, even with his full strength, couldn't do any better. However, he didn't even use 10% of his soul power. High-speed rotation and compression were undoubtedly the reasons why the tiny funnel had become so strong. However, the funnel became very unstable when he lost control of it. There were clear spatial undulations and contortions around the funnel. However, there was a clear gap between that and the beast god's black holes. That was probably because he didn't have enough soul power. It was no wonder the beast god was so formidable. He had stored so much soul power in that state in his body. It would be a surprise if he wasn't that frighteningly powerful. Hui Yuhao understood that controlling such power was far too difficult with his current strength. However, understanding and experiencing the principles concerning this was very beneficial for his future cultivation, so that he didn't take any long roads. He decided to stop experimenting, because he wasn't sure whether he could distance himself from the pull of the funnel using instant teleportation if the funnel became stronger than before. What would happen if he couldn't? That meant he could only detonate it prematurely. Otherwise, the ultimate result would be that his soul power would be sucked dry, or perhaps the funnel would swallow everything. The funnel would increase to an even more frightening state before a tremendous explosion would be triggered. Hui Yuhao had already observed and learned a lot today. As for his next experiment, he felt that it would be a lot safer if he attempted it after he had returned to the academy. Hui Yuhao rushed back to the army camp. The explosion from before was quite loud, but the army camp was ultimately relatively far away, while he had also chosen a valley in the mountains. That was the reason why nothing much happened in the army camp. He silently snuck back to his own tent, but was startled when he lifted his curtain because there was actually someone else in his tent. Tang Wutong was frowning as she stood in the center of the tent and asked as he walked in, "Where did you go?" Hui Yuhao hesitated momentarily as he stammered, "I went to the toilet." Tang Wutong retorted angrily. "Do you need to spend 1 hour on the toilet?" "I have constipation," Hui Yuhao answered feebly. "You?" Tang Wutong grunted furiously as she turned to leave. "Hey, how did you know I wasn't in my tent?" Hui Yuhao asked subconsciously. Tang Wutong had already stomped to the entrance of his tent. She paused and replied, "I was afraid that something would happen to you, so I decided to visit you tonight, and discovered that you weren't here anymore." "Where did you go?" Hui Yuhao could tell that her voice was softening, and Donga's beautiful face surfaced in his mind once more. His heart softened as he spoke the truth. "I went to experiment with a method of controlling soul power. It wasn't very convenient to do it inside the army camp, so I decided to go outside." Tang Wutong turned around and stared at him in shock. "Your body is already like that, why are you still doing experiments? What if something happened? Couldn't you have just waited for 2 more days?" All right, I made a mistake," Hui Yuhao admitted his mistake conscientiously. Tang Wutong grunted and said, "Sleep early. Good night," and she walked away after that. Hui Yuhao was in a little bit of a daze as he watched her departing profile. "Her attitude towards me seems a little better than before. Unfortunately, she's not Donga. How fantastic would everything have been if she were Donga?" Hui Yuhao lamented in his mind as he sat back on his bed and quietly recalled every detail of his experiment. 2 days quickly passed as Hui Yuhao's body gradually recovered. Positive news came back from the front lines. The Sun Moon Empire's internal territories were indeed empty, while the White Tiger Duke's war strategy was extremely successful. The Soul Master legions that had dispersed into the Sun Moon Empire's territories were wreaking havoc everywhere, and they caused great damage to the Sun Moon Empire. The Star Luo Empire had more Soul Masters than the number of Soul Engineers that the Sun Moon Empire had brought back, and this disparity was even wider in terms of the number of powerful individuals. The Sun Moon Empire was badly bruised and battered as the Star Luo Empire overran several of their cities. However, the White Tiger Duke governed his army very strictly. Normal citizens were not to be harmed after the city had fallen, and their armies would pull out of the city after looting and pillaging the governing body's granaries and armories. Conquering cities wasn't the aim of their battle strategy, and wreaking excessive destruction wasn't within the White Tiger Duke's personality either. Pillaging resources was a lot more effective. Furthermore, doing so could also replenish the Star Luo Empire's own expenses. Everyone who participated in the strategy were soul masters, and many of them had storage soul tools. Pillaging was like a gentle breeze for them. Quickly, the Sun Moon Empire's eastern borders were in a state of emergency. Even though their intel was shut off and they didn't know about the Sun Moon Empire's response, or about the Heavenly Soul Empire's situation, the Star Luo Empire's operations would undoubtedly relieve the situation. The White Tiger Duke sent letters back several times to inquire about Huiyuhao's physical state. After he made sure that Huiyuhao was fine, he even personally wrote a commendation for Huiyuhao for his contributions to the Star Luo Empire. The title of Marquis had also been conferred to Huiyuhao. Xu Sancha and the others rested and got ready for another day, and they made sure Huiyuhao had recovered completely before he wrote a letter to the White Tiger Duke to bid their farewells. All 8 of them then departed the Star Luo Empire's army camp and journeyed back toward Shrek Academy. Both the White Tiger Duke and Princess Jiujiu didn't want them to leave. However, the war situation at the front lines was of the utmost priority, so they couldn't take time out to attempt to keep the 8 of them here. Furthermore, they understood that these people from Shrek Academy couldn't be kept. Fortunately, both parties had established an amiable relationship after their missions, especially so after Huiyuhao accepted his title of Marquis. This undoubtedly meant that Huiyuhao was admitting he was a soul master from the Star Luo Empire. Everyone flew through the air. They came as 8, and they returned as 8. Huiyuhao had practically returned from the dead, but everyone managed to return with their lives. However, everyone had experienced the cruelty of war. This was especially so after the top-tier individuals directly participated in the war. The death god Doluo Yi Shishue never appeared again after she departed. At least, the Star Luo Empire had yet to encounter that terrifying ultimate Doluo after they invaded the Sun Moon Empire. But no matter what, this ultimate Doluo was like an enormous shadow that loomed over the Star Luo Empire's head. Her appearance would lead to rivers of blood. The situation had descended into complete chaos. The 8 of them were returning to the academy to protect it, and that was what they absolutely had to do. Even though their individual strengths weren't much for Shrek Academy as a whole, Huiyuhao's status was special, and his presence could even allow Shrek Academy to link up with the Great Star Do Forest Soul Beasts for aid. If that was the case, Shrek Academy would be able to hold their own against the Sun Moon Empire if it was invaded. They maintained a strict formation as they flew through the air. Huiyuhao flew in the center, but his eyes were a little lackadaisical. More accurately put, he had been in this state for the past few days. Whether he was walking, sitting, flying, or perhaps even eating, he would have a dazed and listless demeanor. His companions were a little worried about him, but he would always say that he was just contemplating some things when they asked. The truth was, he wasn't lying, he was contemplating some things that were extremely important to him. That tiny funnel that he was experimenting with was naturally the most important item amongst those things. Huiyuhao had officially concluded his experiment's results after his last experiment. Even though he didn't manage to create a black hole like Diqian soul power in the end, the entire experimental process allowed him to discover and complete things that he had never known about. For instance, soul power would generate tremendous gravitational force once it was compressed into a solid state, and its absorption of external soul power would become stronger. This point was very important for his future cultivation. He was a soul sage, and his soul power had become liquid at this point. His liquid soul power's viscosity would increase as his cultivation increased. Wasn't that distinctly similar to what his soul power was like when he compressed it during the experiment? Furthermore, he had known about this principle a long time ago, that soul masters compressed the soul power inside their body continuously as their soul power increased, before more soul power would be stored. Soul Masters' martial souls would naturally become stronger if their martial souls fused with stronger soul power. Elder Mu had told Huiyu how before that Soul Master's soul power would be continuously accumulated and compressed as they became stronger, and only when they became titled Dolor would things begin to change. However, Elder Mu didn't tell him much about title Dolor. That wasn't because he forgot about those things. Huiyuhao's cultivation was still very low at that point, and Elder Mu feared that Huiyuhao would attempt to run before he could walk. Huiyuhao recalled what Elder Mu had told him. According to Elder Mu, a Soul Master's soul power would reach the limit of its conversion from liquid to solid as he or she reached the pinnacle of an 8-ringed Soul Dolor, which was rank 89, while titled Dolor would probably have entirely solid soul power. One of the most prominent characteristics of solid-state soul power was probably the fact that they could leverage the origin energy of heaven and earth in the air better. Huiyuhao had already felt this in his experiment from before. Even if the solid-state soul power didn't absorb the Soul Master's own soul power, it would still continuously absorb the origin energy in the air by itself. The pertinent soul skill's strength would therefore increase throughout this process. This experiment was equivalent to opening a door to another world for Huiyuhao, and it allowed him to see stranger things regarding Soul Masters. The first thing he wanted to do when he returned to the academy was to seek out Elder Xian so that he could answer his questions and clear up his confusion. "Hey, are you all right? Why are you always in such a daze? Did your injuries this time damage your brain?" Tang Wutong was flying beside him, and she couldn't help but ask him that question. "This fellow has been like this over the past few days. Everyone is worried about him, but they can't really press him any further for fear of upsetting him. He keeps saying that's he's fine, he's alright, but he doesn't seem like he's alright at all." "Eh?" Huiyuhao was deep in thought, and his thoughts became a little jumbled when he heard Tang Wutong's voice. He frowned a little and said, "Of course I'm fine. I'm just thinking about some things." Tang Wutong rolled her eyes and said, "What do you have to think about, that you have to do that for a few days? It's fine if something is wrong with you, just treat it as quickly as possible. Don't force yourself." Huiyuhao snapped, "Nothing is wrong with me. I'm perfectly fine. There are some questions that I need to think more about, so don't interrupt my train of thought." With that, he continued flying forward as he began to contemplate once more. "This guy?" Tang Wutong glared at him, but he didn't respond at all. "He doesn't recognize my good intentions at all. HMPH. Everyone flew continuously until midday before Shu Sancha, who had taken point, suggested for everyone to descend and have a rest. It was quite a coincidence that they descended onto a spot next to a wide river. This enormous river was 100 meters wide, and the flow of the water was very rapid. Even though it wasn't very clear, one would consider the bluish-green river water's clarity to be decent if its volume was taken into account. "Huiyuhao, I want to eat grilled fish. This river is so huge, I'm sure there are enough fish here. They must be very fat and juicy," Nen Qiuqiu exclaimed joyfully. "Ah? Grilled fish?" Huiyuhao stared at her, and his eyes looked a little blank. Shu Sancha smiled and said, "Yes, Yuhao. Your grilled fish is the best in the world. Give us another taste of it. Everyone will probably get busy once we get back to the academy. You should also stop thinking and rest your mind a little bit. You should switch up your thoughts once in a while no matter what you're contemplating." Huiyuhao couldn't really decline his request as he saw everyone's hopeful eyes. He nodded and went ahead to catch some fish. Tang Wutong secretly swallowed some saliva as she heard that they were eating grilled fish. She could still vividly recall the aromatic fragrance from the last time. Catching fish was like a hot knife on butter for a soul sage. Huiyuhao chose to use the simplest and most brutal method. He froze some of the river's water before he transformed it into icy spheres and detonated them in the water with ice explosion. The vigorous shockwaves flipped a large amount of fish out, and Huiyuhao used controlling crane capturing dragon to pull them onto the shore. The entire process took a little more than 10 seconds, and he proceeded to then process the fish. Yi Gai and Nen Qiuqiu had already gone to collect firewood, while the others helped out in their own way to prepare rations and start a fire. Huiyuhao's movement was extremely quick. His deep thoughts over the past few days were very helpful to him, and he had an increasingly strong feeling that he had found the right path. Therefore, he was eager to continue thinking. The fish were processed after a short while, and a fire had been started. The grilling had begun. Hui Yuhao didn't do anything different from the last time. He was still very familiar with the techniques for grilling fish, and grilled fish quickly appeared one after another in his companion's hands for them to enjoy. "Oh, this is good, it's so good," Nan Qiuqiu exclaimed elatedly as she ate. Tang Wutong was also eating, but she realized that today's grilled fish seemed a little different from the last time when they were traveling toward the Star Luo Empire's northwestern field army. The fish still tasted fresh and delicious, while the fire had been controlled extremely well, but something seemed to be missing. In a more exaggerated sense, the grilled fish seemed to lack spirit. Tang Wutong sat down beside Jiang Nan Nan. She couldn't help but whisper, "Sister Nan Nan, do you see any difference between the grilled fish today and the one we had the last time?" Jiang Nan Nan was momentarily stunned. "Difference? Nope. The fish is very tasty. You don't think it's nice?" Tang Wutong shook her head and replied, "Not that, I just feel like something seems to be missing from the last time." Jiang Nan Nan was dazed for another moment before a deep look appeared in her eyes. She whispered, "I think you're right. Hui Yuhao thought you were Donga when he grilled fish for everyone the last time. He gave voice to the emotions in his inner heart when he was grilling for you. Afterwards, it should be because he realized that you're not Donga, so he has treated you like everyone else." "Eh?" Tang Wutong stared at Jiang Nan Nan, surprised. She turned her eyes toward the grilled fish in her hands. "The fish is missing emotions? It's missing a spirit? Can emotions be infused into a fish? In that case, his feelings for Wang Donga must be very deep." For some reason, envy seemed to develop in her heart as her thoughts stopped here. Everyone was satisfied after eating the grilled fish, and they continued their journey. It was midnight when they returned to Shrek City. Xu Sancha and the others went back to the Tang sect, while Hui Yuhao and Tang Wutong went to Shrek Academy. Hui Yuhao was the group leader, so he had to report the results of their expedition to Elder Xian. Tang Wutong didn't belong to the Tang sect, and she was staying in Shrek Academy in the first place. Darkness permeated the skies. Hui Yuhao and Tang Wutong weren't flying anymore as they walked toward Shrek Academy, as that was a form of respect for the academy. Shrek City had transformed quite a bit over this period of time. With the full effort of the academy and the Doluo continent's 3 native empires, the new Shrek City's construction speed was one of the fastest in the continent. According to their current speed, they would need 1 more year at most before the Shrek City's overall structure would take shape, and they would need another 3 years after that before the new city would be completely established. Once the new Shrek City was constructed, its scale would rival that of Star Luo City and Heaven Do City. It would be second only to the Sun Moon Empire's Radiant City, which was the #1 city on the continent. The academy's main gates were already shut. However, that didn't pose a problem to Hui Yuhao or Tang Wutong at all. Hui Yuhao didn't want to disturb anyone, so he used imitation before he concealed both Tang Wutong and himself, and they discreetly leapt over the wall. The Sea God's Lake came into view in the distance. Hui Yuhao stopped as he arrived at the lakeside, and Tang Wutong did the same. The night sky was impressive tonight. Moonlight shone across the Sea God's Lake, and it cast light on the lake's clear ripples and waves. The moonlight was gentle, while all sorts of vegetation stacked on each other by the lakeside. The Sea God's Island was barely visible in the distance, as if this were a paradise on earth. Hui Yuhao began to feel dazed as he saw everything in front of him. He could still clearly remember the time when he had realized that Donga was a girl, weren't they, on Sea God's Lake? The Sea God's fated blind date. Everything that had happened that day left an extremely deep impression in his mind. Idiot, I'm her idiot. I was with her for such a long time, yet I didn't realize she was a girl. That was really stupid of me. He recounted all the sweetness and tenderness he had shared with Donga, and the corner of his mouth curled into a faint smile. He felt as if he could see Donga once more under the moonlight. Donga, have you really been beside me this entire time? But why don't you show yourself to see me? Hui Yuhao reached inside as he reminisced, and retrieved the handkerchief that he had treasured this entire time. Tang Wutong was but momentarily stunned by the beautiful scenery on Sea God's Lake as she arrived by the lakeside. She was about to return to Sea God's Island, but she immediately realized that Hui Yuhao was in a daze once more. Except, this was different from the last time. The way he was dazed from before seemed very muddlehead, as if he were very deep in thought. However, his eyes were very gentle in this moment, much like the moonlight reflecting off the lake. The corner of his mouth was curled upward, and there was a slight smile on his face. She instantly froze when she saw him reach into his shirt and take out a handkerchief that felt extremely familiar to her. Isn't that my handkerchief? Hui Yuhao closed his eyes as he held onto the handkerchief and slowly took a deep breath through his nose. The moist air on the lakeside and the clear and fresh smell of vegetation wafted into his nose, while the handkerchief's crisp aroma that he had yearned for was also part of all those refreshing smells that he was familiar with. He felt as if his heart and mind were both intoxicated as his entire body relaxed. Tang Wutong was just watching him from beside him. She blushed a little. Why is he holding my handkerchief? Does that mean he knows that I was sleeping beside him that night? Hui Yuhao opened his eyes as he looked down at the handkerchief in his hands and heaved a faint sigh. Donga, when will you return to my side? Have you really forgotten about me, or do you have some hidden troubles? If you have any problems, why don't you let me face them together with you? Bastard. He thinks my handkerchief belongs to her. Tang Wutong was so upset that she started to pout. Hui Yuhao was completely immersed in his wonderful memories. Naturally, he wasn't paying attention to Tang Wutong's emotional changes. However, she didn't disturb him and was just standing next to him. This bastard is quite concentrated in his love. Tang Wutong couldn't help but recall the first time she had met Hui Yuhao. He almost immediately charged at her and embraced her in his arms, and that embrace was burning with passion and filled with emotions. Tang Wutong was overcome with embarrassment at that time, but she felt as if she were about to melt in his arms. She began to feel a little feverish when she recalled that moment. This video will end here.